Hey, what's up, guys? So on the last episode of Muscle Minds, we talked all about the central nervous system. We learned how as you get stronger, your central nervous system becomes more resilient. It helps you to be able to push heavier loads and increase your intensity in your training. Today, we're going to talk about the flip side of that coin and how as bodybuilders, it's important that as we get stronger, that we're using our muscle and not our central nervous system to move the weight. Scott has a bunch of charts, graphs, and studies, and we are going to dig into the science as usual today on Muscle Minds. What's up, guys? Welcome back to Muscle Minds with Scott Stevenson. I'm Scott McDaly. All of our programming is brought to you by True Nutrition. And today we are going to dive back into central nervous system adaptation from training. And what did you say here, Scott? This is like applying central nervous system training adaptations to produce muscle growth.
Yeah, it gives some more specific context to the things we talked about last time, like all the stuff related to the central nervous system. But specifically, it's just none of this is, there's more updated information, but this is all these are taken from a review article that a guy named Digby Sale put out a long while ago. It's hard to study these things in the context of resistance exercise and training, but it's some basic ideas, and here's the overall context. It's really kind of important, and I have actually a lot more in a particular talk that I give on the mind-muscle connection. And the main theme is that our bodies and our nervous system in particular have been engineered through nature, through our biology, through evolution, to find the most economical, quote, efficient way to lift loads and to produce movement. So it's a huge investment in just making the muscle bigger when you can obviously get better performance just by changing how you drive it.
Yes.
Meaning how the nervous system activates it. We see that with that first thing that I mentioned, like right at the beginning, I think, of the last podcast we did, was where if you look at the extent to which muscle strength goes up in a newbie, you can double your strength in a matter of a half a year easily for many people, but you haven't doubled your muscle mass.
Yeah.
So that's the nervous system. And the nervous system it's so much easier to get more skillful in a certain way. Even though you wouldn't consider these like skilled movements, you're just picking something straight up. But obviously like Olympic lifts, squats, multi-joint movements do entail a good amount of skill, but there's actually underneath what's going on all sorts of very important things that are adaptations that allow you to get so much stronger. We're not going to go into it like a ton of those. We can if people have questions, or if you do, I'll expound upon some of the ideas. But like even things like if you look in the brain at the parts of the motor areas that are involved with sending signals down to the muscles during a concentric versus an eccentric movement. So when you lift versus you load, different areas of the brain is activated, turned on and off for each aspect of those.
No kidding. Turned on and off. So I'm thinking, I think of the things being turned on, but I wouldn't think of other areas being turned off, but it does make sense.
Yeah, I mean, they're different patterns, and they require substantially different amounts of muscle mass being activated. Concentrics, you're much weaker relative to eccentrics, and that's a function of speed. So the faster a movement, the less amount of force you can produce concentrically. Whereas eccentrically, you can produce more force than you can voluntarily. And it's pretty much, an absolute certainty that some of that you have some level of inhibition during an eccentric movement. Even maximal eccentrics, there's probably some inhibition. EMG suggests that the amount of force that most people can produce during maximal lengthening contractions, when you get in an isokinetic machine, for instance, and it forces you down on a knee extension or whatever thing, you just can't produce as much force relative to the muscle that's there than you can when you force that muscle to contract with electrical stimulation. Your brain, your nervous system, the inhibitory influences are definitely there to protect you from just tearing the muscle.
Yeah.
So when to lift a load, let's say I had a 20-pound dumbbell here and I curled it up. If I still activated the same amount of muscle, that dumbbell would never go down unless, eventually I had fatigue and I just wouldn't be able to hold it up. But assuming if we take fatigue out of the picture, you lift something up, and then to lower it, you have to activate less muscle.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You have to turn off some of those neurons. The data is kind of mixed as to what the population is of the neurons used to lift versus low. Some people have suggested that there's even sort of a different subpopulation of neurons, like you might use more type 2s, maybe, but probably not. There's some data suggesting that when lowering things. Some of that's probably a function of training, but so like in a very basic level, just lifting and lowering involves like a totally different activation pattern. It's like forward and reverse on your car.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're doing. Like if you think about it, like, you know, if something in the mechanism of your car that allows you to go forward and backward were to grow by virtue of driving forward really fast and driving backward and then just keeping driving over the same spot over and over, which is what we do when we lift and lower a weight repeatedly, then you can see that there's a totally different things. Putting the car in drive versus putting it in reverse is a complete change in the basic function of the vehicle.
Sure.
Complete change in direction. So neurologically, it's completely different. So anyway, the point of that's just one little piece that shows you like there's so much involved with the nervous system that's going to step in and make it such that, you know, if we can just make a nervous system adjustment in skill or motivated activation pattern, firing rate, or they call it rate coding sometimes, then that's a much simpler thing to do, you know, than to make the muscle bigger. It's sort of like you want to drive faster, well, for a given level of effort or a given level of foot pedal pressure on your accelerator. Well, you just press the accelerator a little bit more. That's like a nervous system adaptation. Very simple one to do. Or you could go out and get a bigger engine that just runs at a faster speed for a given RPMs and signal from the foot pedal. That's a huge pain in the ass when the most immediate thing you can do is simply get better at learning how to drive faster, which just means pressing on the accelerator more.
Yeah.
So our whole system is set up to be able to make those adjustments by changing the nervous system, because there's so many points of flexibility and neuroplasticity that are available there, which don't require the outlay of energy that comes with building muscle, which is a huge, you know, everything I've talked about with changing the architecture of the cell and the satellite cells and the amount of food you have to eat and making sure you have enough protein available and rest. And like, that's a giant deal. Like, who's ever changed an engine block? I haven't, but it's a big fucking deal to change the engine in a vehicle, you know?
Mm-hmm.
They did that to my F-350. It took a while. I got a brand new engine in there after I blew out the other one.
Yeah, I remember
That's a big friggin' deal, you know? It's easier just to drive with a little more accelerator.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what the nervous system is. So, so the trick then is, and this is why I want to just talk about this for a while, is let people kind of get an understanding for how good the nervous system is with that, is to make sure that you're doing things that put the stress on the muscle, especially in the context of progressive overload. Because that's the thing, as you probably know, anyone who's done progressive overload, you just look at the logbook and you just want to beat that damn logbook. And you can beat those reps just by going faster, getting sloppy. There's a million ways to do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you provided more stress and stimulus for the muscle. And the other side of the coin is it doesn't necessarily mean that those increases that you see in reps or load in the logbook represent more muscle that you gained. It may be that you've just got sloppier with your form, or you went faster, or something like that. I'll throw out an anecdote which was pretty fascinating. I'll never forget this. I think I've mentioned this on this podcast before, but long time ago, like literally almost, this is 25 years ago maybe. When I was in grad school, I was training people in the morning at a gym. And I had a guy come in, and he and his dad both came in, and his dad had owned a construction company. He was a contractor. He'd worked construction his entire life. So, and you could tell he's a rugged guy, just strong, and had to be strong to do what he'd done. His son also worked construction. But I think his son maybe was now, you know, sort of more on the administrative side. So they wanted to start training. The dad had worked construction. Now he's not doing that kind of thing. He, you know, it's like, I'm getting a little bit fat now because I'm not working, and the business has gotten bigger. So they want to find a trainer and start exercising. Yeah. I'm just giving them basic stuff, like trying to show them how to do things. And I'm noticing with the dad that, like, he has in everything we're starting to do, he has an inability to just activate the target muscle.
Huh.
He wants to use as much muscle as he possibly can.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what you want to do when you're on a job site.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, if you're going to go pick something up, you don't stand upright and try to do like a strict curl with it.
Right.
You know, use your legs, not your low back as much as you can, and engage as much muscle mass. You use momentum. You know, get things moving and dynamically move them. If you got to throw some sandbags up to the back of your pickup truck, you know, you don't squat down and stand up with them and then do a strict curl and put them on like some kind of a robot in an assembly line. You know, you exert the least amount of energy possible.
Yeah.
So his nervous system, he had done, you know, so many tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of repetitions of that kind of shit through the course of his life that it was really weird. It was like totally foreign to him to try to do it any differently.
Similar, probably like a power lifter who comes to bodybuilding, you know?
That's exactly the difference that I talk about at the beginning of that talk, is that powerlifting, the idea is to engage as much muscle mass as you can to do the big three lifts in a way that, you know, matches whatever the standard is, you know, correct depth and everything else. You want to engage everything available.
Yeah.
Because that gives you more driving force. You're not trying to like just use your pecs to do a bench press at all. No. It's completely the opposite. You want to use everything possible. You know, people talk about hip and leg drive on a bench press.
Yeah.
You know, as long as butt's not coming off the bench and whatever things are illegal in, you know, your federation, do it. It just matters that the weight moves from point A to point B. Whereas bodybuilding is really pretty much the opposite in most cases, especially isolation exercises. You're trying to like get the other muscles out of the, except with one exception, which we can talk about too, because this is something I want to, maybe we do a whole podcast on it, but definitely need to do a post on sloppy form. And I've talked about it here before, but how that actually makes sense in terms of producing muscle growth, some slop in your form.
Okay. Yeah, that would be a fun topic. We should do that.
I mentioned it, but no one seems to get this. And it's just like, it's definitely one of my hobby horses, I guess you might say, as far as topics goes.
All right. Well, I'll make note on that one.
Yeah. So with this older guy, though, so he's doing everything like this. I'm like, well, let's just do some curls. I said, actually, let's just do some dumbbell concentration curls.
Okay.
So, you know, we get down, block off your elbow on the inner part of your knee, and you got the dumbbell there, and you're hunkered down. All I want to do is just see movement at your elbow joint, just like pure. And sometimes I'll say to people, imagine like if you've ever been to like Walt Disney World, I think they have one of those rides where it's like the Pirates Cove or some shit. And you hit on a log ride thing, and you float through the water, and like they have all the pirates and the ghosts and those sorts of things. And like the first pirate's like, welcome to Walt Disney World, and it's just like, you know, one joint is moving like and nothing else. It's completely, you know, non-authentic for a human. You can tell it's just purely robotic. That's what I'm saying. Just be like one of those really cheap robots. I just want to see movement in the one joint, nothing else. So he's hunkered down. You can't really kind of see me here in the video, but he's hunkered down and he's curling up and he's pulling his shoulder girdle back and he's arching his back. And I'm like, no, don't do that. And I put my arms around his shoulder. I said, I don't want your shoulder to bounce into my hands. I want your shoulder joint to stay right where it is. Movement only at this elbow joint. He could not do it.
Holy shit! Yeah.
He literally because that's not how you would pick. You'd throw some body English into it. That's what you see people do when they're doing cheat curls.
Yeah.
He couldn't not do a cheat curl, so to speak, because he had just been programmed for so long. So that's a highly evolved, in a certain way, nervous system that allowed that guy to do heavy manual labor for like decades and not be completely broken down. He just figured out how to do it the right way. And I had some guys come out and help me move actually some of my gym equipment. There was a guy who was like the veteran of the leader of the group, and he was at least in his mid-late 40s, and actually kind of a smaller dude, really, really skinny, like had like his body fat was like zilch. Yeah. Because just working all the time. It was really kind of interesting talking to him. And he outworked all these dudes. Yeah. But you could just see how he moved. It was like artistry in motion, at least for me, and watching him picking up I'm like, I knew how much that shit weighed because I moved it myself several times. And I'm like, I'm just not moving this one again. It was worth my while, and instead of spending 3 days to have these guys do it in 3 hours. And it's like the guy had just all these really highly evolved motor programs, but he was literally skinny as a rail. He was probably, I don't know, maybe my height and 110 pounds.
Holy crap.
Really, really thin. Like you would think he was very bright and very animated. Like he was a healthy guy, as healthy as you could be. I think he just drank Gatorade most of the time all day long.
I think he might have been on meth. I think he might have been on meth, Scott. I think you're making a mistake about the healthy thing here.
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe he could have been. But he'd been.
It's Florida.
I talked to him because we went and picked it up and moved things over. He didn't seem like he was on meth, and he'd been doing this a long time. Most meth addicts wouldn't last like decades.
Good point. Good point. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you got about 6 to 9 months running at that speed if you're on meth.
How many teeth did he have?
But he did. Say what?
Nothing. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You say how many teeth did he have?
Yeah.
No, that's the thing. He was a really bright, vibrant guy.
Yeah.
You know, that's why I kind of remember him. And I watched, and he's like, I bet you think you could do this. I'm like, I have no, no, I'm not delusional at all. There's no way. I mean, I like to move shit around, that thing, but you guys would just wreck me. I'd be totally broken down after a week of it.
Yeah.
So you probably had lots of big guys come to you think they can just do this shit, no problem. He's like, all the time. We just eat them up and spit them out. I'm like, I know you do. So he was actually, this is a really good example I hadn't planned on talking about, but he was a great example of someone who was able to move really, really heavy loads, but with great efficiency or economy on a regular basis all day long. So a huge volume of heavy lifting, not resistance exercise like in the gym, but huge volume of heavy lifting on a daily basis without nutritional support, and a highly evolved set of neural programs that allowed him to know how to pick things up. And he would he knew how to use a forklift. He knew how to use the dollies that they had, carpet dolly, whatever dolly. But he also was just really good at picking things up. You could just see how he just knew how to pick the right leverages and the right angles. So that's what people do on like a leg press. You showed that video, and people will know that you can move more weight if you don't go as deep on a leg press. Well, the purpose on the leg press, and there's a study that just came out. I think I saw it through Mass. I didn't read it all, but because I subscribe to their newsletter. It's good news, great, phenomenal newsletter, as a matter of fact. But they showed increases in glute and I believe also hamstring size, as well as quad, with deep squatting, whereas only the shallower squatting, maybe it was 90 degrees, but it wasn't like ass to grass, only produced growth in the quads. So a lot of people want to squat for their entire leg, for the entire, the glutes and the thigh musculature. That's what happened with the deep squatting. But you can move more weight and get more reps with shallower squats. That's an obvious thing if that's all you're looking for. So that very obvious notion, which people call other people out on for all the time, in the squat in inches a mile, as they say, is the same thing that applies at a much more nuanced level that we're not even totally aware of because of all these things that are sort of programmed into our brain in terms of neural activation. So anyway, let me see which figure makes sense. We'll throw up a figure and I can kind of talk people through this. A lot of this is just from one study, actually.
Right. I have them all. I downloaded them from you in order here. So I have the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth one here.
That first one with the trained arm.
Yep, got it.
And that's a nice one. That shows a couple of different things at once.
Okay, that one is up.
So that shows, that's just this is all from a review article. I can find the original article from that, but that shows a bilateral training study where you see a couple things happen. They trained one arm, unilateral training study. They trained one arm and the other arm was not trained. So if you look across at the bar graphs, there is strength at the very top. You've got a greater increase in strength in the trained arm, but this commonly noted cross-training effect was apparent there in strength as well. So the untrained arm on the right actually increased in strength, even though it wasn't trained. So the nervous system, this is a really, really common cross-training effect, it's called, most of the time. And this is why people will say, hey, you should, in order to maintain strength in an arm that's been casted or a side of your body that's been injured for some reason that you can't train or it's been immobilized, train the good side.
I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah, this is the main rationale for that is
Holy
that you
crap.
maintain you maintain the neurological adaptations
Huh.
that are contribute to your strength in doing so through
Yeah.
via this cross training effect. So
Wow.
you could see actually if you look at the activation level, this is the third bar graph down. This is at max activation. You see and this is just a rough. I think this is probably a root mean square EMG measurement, just a generic level of total electrical activity, maximal electrical activity. So the rough raw neural input descending from the brain to the biceps, the elbow flexors in this case, I think it was, is greater because not in the untrained arm, because the other arm was being trained. So activation levels has gone up. So you can maintain those neurological adaptations by training a good side, and it'll still carry over or crossover to the other side. So you can see over the course of the training, there was about a 10%, maybe an 8% increase in cross-sectional area in the trained arm, which is on the left. And then if they so here's what's kind of interesting. If you relativize the amount of activation during a max effort relative to the force that was produced, that actually went down. So something about the activation was more coordinated, such that the amount of activation produced, the electrical activity in general to produce a given amount of force was reduced. And those are some of the deeper aspects of neural adaptations that are really pretty cool. We probably don't need to get into. I don't want to get too far off topic with that. But you basically get better, neurologically speaking, at producing more force, as well as you don't have to expend as much activation energy. You become more skilled, which is what's represented there in that amount of activation for a given amount of force. So each amount of force is actually also relatively easier because of the neurological adaptations, as well as the fact that in this case, because they're testing during the movement that they actually trained with, there's more muscle mass there.
Okay.
So you would expect that too. If you the same amount of activation with a bigger muscle will just give you more force.
Yeah.
So that would reduce that activation relative to force value. So there's two things that are going on there. One, nervous system is adapted. It's figured out how to be more energetically efficient in terms of sending the neural impulses down to produce amount of force. And now you have a bigger motor in the way of having a bigger muscle. So you see that.
Okay.
So, and that's a percent change of over 30% or 20% in the untrained arm. So that's pretty substantial in terms of just EMG, or strength, whereas the cross-sectional area went up 8%. So here we're talking about a fourfold greater increase in strength relative to the increase in cross-sectional area.
Okay.
So if you want to talk real roughly, it's only 1/5 of your strength gains could be explained by increase in cross-sectional area.
Increased by muscle, you're saying?
Yeah, more muscle. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense, I guess. That if you get, you have to get a lot stronger for a long time before you see a muscle change. And you got that guy who was the skinny dude who was lifting a lot, but it didn't show up as muscle for him.
He probably had genetics to be kind of thin, ectomorphic, if you want to use that term. He wasn't eating to support it. He wasn't doing anything to try to get bigger. In fact, here's the thing, and in his case, and everyone's got different genetic programming, but given what he was doing, having that phenotype, having a body that's like that, because he moved pretty quickly too, and he moved all day long.
Yeah.
So he actually had sort of a strength endurance type of physical load that he was presented with, at least probably 5 out of 7 days out of the week.
Yeah.
So rather than the body saying, okay, well let's do this. You're picking up really heavy shit. Let's put on 50 pounds of muscle that you then have to carry around with you, which is dead weight for half. Let's say half of your time is spent going back to get the next load. So 50% of the time you're just dragging the dead weight around. Then you have to eat to accommodate all of that. Well, he wasn't eating to accommodate all of that. I think he literally was just drinking Gatorade. A lot of those guys, who work, especially here in Florida where it's so hot, all you want to do is get fluids in.
Yeah.
You're not trying to eat a big meal, man. You get something for breakfast maybe, and then you just have a giant meal when you get home. So that was a very smart way for his system to adapt. Obviously, he knew how to move the weights around. His nervous system had adapted in a way that made him really, really proficient at doing all that. So we're trying to hack the system and basically avoid becoming proficient to a certain degree, but at the same time use the loads that come with progressive overload as a way to stimulate and send that specific signal that there's going to be no neural adaptations that are involved here with making this easier to do. We're going to continue to stress the muscle in a way that really sort of sends the signals like, okay, we're going to have to get bigger, because that's just the nature of the beast. There's no way around it. Mm-hmm. And plus there's plenty of nutritional anabolism supplements or super supplements to support that kind of growth.
So how do we do that, Scott? That's the question.
We're getting there.
Okay.
I got a couple more things. So this is what's interesting here. So let's throw up we can skip this. The trained arm and untrained arm with the two plots, we'll skip that.
Okay.
We'll go to the one that has the guy at the top, sort of the little squatting figure there.
Got him. He's up.
So this was a study where they trained individuals using a squat, and they increased muscle size in the quads by about 10%, I believe it was. I have the there you go, it just popped up. I have the actual original study here. I just didn't put that in there. So here's the interesting thing. So they trained for, I can't remember how long it was. I could look at it. Standard training regime. Increased in squat 1 rep max was about 70%. Pretty substantial. But that's all they did to increase to train. They weren't doing leg presses. They weren't doing knee extensions. They just were squatting. So when they tested 1 rep max on the squat, it went up quite a bit.
Yeah.
Fortunately, they didn't make any EMG measurements on the squat or elsewhere, but they did do it on knee extension. I'll get to that in just a second.
Okay.
So squat's a compound movement. You're driving with your hips and your knees. So they also tested strength on a leg press because they had that there in the lab. A lot of times they'll just test all the shit they have there.
Yeah.
And you got some strength gains in the leg press, but they didn't train with that leg press. So there was some carryover. So this shows very distinctly the specificity of training principle, is that if you train to get stronger or bigger using squats, you're going to get stronger during squatting movements. And it's going to be greatest during the particular movement that you employ. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
When you try to take that strength and apply it to a leg press, it's pretty close. You only get about half the strength gains in this particular study. They didn't train the leg press. But it's not too different in terms of the segments being a compound movement, et cetera, et cetera. Now remember, they've got a bigger quad. So they put them on a knee extension and also did a maximal voluntary contraction. So that's an isometric. And they didn't do any of those in their training. But it's just a knee extension. You just sit there, they strap you in, you say, okay, kick out your knee as hard as you can. They've got bigger quads. 10% is substantial. You'll see that. That's visible.
Yeah.
Like that's a before and after you'd post, on social media.
I'll take that.
Because the leg, that's pretty damn good. No increase in strength. Nothing.
No increase on the leg extension. Huge increase on the squat, which they trained. Some increase on the leg press, which they did not train. No increase on the leg extension. That surprises me, I guess.
No carryover.
Huh.
Yeah, none.
Wow.
Yep. The EMG actually went down a little bit.
Huh.
So they kind of speculated as to what could that possibly be. Literally, their MVC, there's a little bit of a blip there, but it wasn't significant. Basically, within measurement error, they got nothing.
Wow.
There's a couple things that could have happened. Well, first of all, that's totally non-specific to how they trained. So, in fact, if you think about it, when you're training and doing a squat, and this is another like kind of a mind fuck for people who haven't thought about it before, but you're activating both your hamstrings and your quads simultaneously, obviously.
Right.
So you got something going on, in your hamstring, for instance, and even in your rectus femoris, but in your hamstring particularly, it's called Lombard's paradox, because if anyone who's listening to this, who's sitting down, they can think about this. So when you stand up from a seated position, at your hip joint, you're extending at the hip.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Hip extension. So that's your hamstrings, which cross both the hip and the knee.
Mm-hmm.
And your hamstrings are doing a concentric contraction. So they're shortening, right?
Yeah.
And they're contracting. We know this. You can feel it when you stand up. But your hamstrings also cross the knee. So what kind of contraction is being produced when you consider the hamstrings and the knee when you're extending at the knee while the hamstrings are contracting? Are they getting shorter or getting longer? Thinking about just the knee.
The hamstring?
Uh-huh. They're contracting, but the knee is extending, not flexing.
They would be getting longer.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what's going on with the hamstrings? They're shortening relative to the hip and extending relative to the knee.
Yeah.
It's a paradox.
Yeah. Okay. I guess it is.
Paradox. Yeah. So that's a translation of angular momentum that happens in biarticular muscles. They sort of function to bring about, like, you take some of the torque that's produced by the glutes and the hip extensors, and they get translated into the knee, and it's basically a biomechanical phenomenon that's really pretty cool, that you see in like jumping and running muscles. So, and anyway, the reason I bring that up is that now you go from squatting or even leg pressing, where you've got hamstrings and quads being activated in a coordinated manner during these movements, short, like maybe not changing length much in the hamstrings, but definitely being activated. The quads are obviously shortening and lengthening. We're not thinking about the rectus femoris now because that's also biarticular, but the other three quad muscles are doing concentric and eccentric contractions. So that's how you train. And now when you come and sit down on a knee extension and you just try to do a knee extension, what the hell are your hamstrings supposed to do?
I see.
Nothing, right? Because they're not needed, but you will have co-contraction when you do that. And they demonstrated that when you bring people in, you say, just do a knee extension, their hamstrings will fire up. So that could have been reducing the force, especially because the way they trained required both hamstring and quad contraction at the same time, or co-contraction. So at any rate, there was no strength gain there on the knee extension at all, even though there was muscle size gain. So let me see if there's anything else here worth looking into before I dig in, like kind of translate some of this stuff into what it really means. Yeah, let's go to, we can come back to those if we need to. Mm-hmm. Let's go to the last one that shows a drop jump.
All right. Got it.
Just talk about this briefly a little bit. So this shows, remember I talked about inhibition and disinhibition last time?
Yes.
For like those maximal efforts, and how like Jordan is someone who shakes a lot sometimes on his max effort lifts. That'll happen to people when they're pushing really, really hard. So this figure, let me take a look at it here so I can talk through it, shows this is after people had been trained doing drop jumps.
Okay.
Which is a very ballistic movement. So basically, if you look at what's going on in the plantar flexors, like your gastroc, your soleus, you jump off a box and you bounce off the floor, and you get what's called it's a stretch shortening cycle, and the nervous system hopefully can harness some of that energy, and you produce actually an eccentric contraction at the calf muscle where the Achilles tendon is. I may have mentioned this last time too. That big long Achilles tendon actually is a giant spring, and you load up that spring with tension so that after you hit the ground and you try to jump back up, that tension that's produced, that's in the spring of the Achilles tendon, can be harnessed to produce plantar flexion to increase the jump that you get. So you get you stretch shortening, so you stretch the muscle out to some degree when you land, and then it shortens right afterwards. And that's basically using the muscle as a rubber band and taking advantage of the connective tissue pieces that are in the muscle, the series elastic components, as people call them, as a rubber band to harness elastic energy and then use that recoil to propel back. So that happens every time we run, for instance. That's one of the reasons, probably this explains at least, why you see a lot of the best sprinters in the world. They don't have gigantic calves like you do. They don't, because they don't need them. The calf muscle is not there to necessarily drive maximal fast propulsion during a sprint. You just need to have enough muscle to, and having a big tendon is good, enough muscle to be able to hold tension to allow that tendon to stretch out and gather the elastic energy that's then used on the recoil to spring forward during the plantar flexion and the drive phase of the running gait. So you don't need a bunch of muscle mass. What you want is a bigger spring.
Yeah.
The bigger the spring, the better. The bigger the spring, the smaller the muscle. So you see a lot of really good sprinters who have very small calves. So that's what's going on there. So here's what's happening neurologically. So when you have someone who's untrained, which is that top plot there, that's an EMG. That's electrical activity, and that trace shows what happens when they jump off the box, and then when they hit. In the top trace, you see where it says inhibition there?
Mm-hmm.
When you hit the ground and under high force, you start to stretch out that muscle, those inhibitory influences, the Golgi tendon organs, come into play, and they reduce muscle force as a protective mechanism. And this is what happens to me every time I jump down off of anything. You ever jump down off of, like, for me, it's like anything over about 12 inches, you hit the ground, and it's just a thud.
Yes.
You're like, oh shit, that some of that's inhibition. Because you're not having any activation of the muscle to harness some of that energy in the tendons and in the series elastic components of the muscle. So you just thud it just like bone on concrete or whatever, pretty much, with a thin layer of shoe sole in between you. So you get inhibition because you're not used to that. And it's like better to sort of crumble and fall than stay upright and produce tensions that are dangerous to the muscle and tear something.
I see.
When you land that hard.
Yeah.
Unless you start training. So normally you have inhibition, and people I think can sort of conceptually grasp that, because like that happens to me every time I step, even off like a high step, it'll feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas someone who's trained will have something else happen. So when they hit the ground, you see the electrical activity increases during that time when they're on the ground before they spring back up after these box jumps.
Yeah.
And that's because you want to have increased activity in the muscle so the muscle holds tight so the tendon can stretch out. So you want the muscular pieces of muscles all the way through the whole kinetic change from across the ankle, the knee, and the hip to all be nice and solid so that you can use that elastic energy, because that's free. It's just coming from gravity, essentially.
Yeah.
And harness that like a rubber ball and bounce back up. In fact, people who get really good at drop jumps like this, you see this like volleyball players or basketball players or athletes who do a lot of these, because being able to jump high, receivers, be able to catch a ball, what have you, they can actually like do like a 3-foot drop or even like 5 or 6 feet. They can jump off a box that's 5 feet and end up jumping onto something that's 6 feet high.
All right.
They can harness like almost pretty much all of the energy that comes from the drop and then add to it with their own muscular energy and go even higher.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that in people who like do a lot of plyometrics. It's really pretty cool. This is how badass the nervous system is people will get better at figuring out how to harness that energy. So you'll have athletes who, when you give them a 3-foot drop jump, they can maybe jump. The highest they can get after that is 4 feet. Let's say.
Okay.
I'm just making up numbers. These may be off. So then you say, well, let's jump it to 3.5, and then then they can get 4 feet, 5 inches. And you go to 4 feet, and they can get almost 5 feet. And the higher you give them, the more energy input you give them from the actual drop, the more their nervous system, because it's so fine-tuned, can harness that as elastic energy and translate it into the hop that they get back up onto the next box.
Yeah, okay.
So they couldn't get to 4 feet or 5 feet, let's say, with a 3-foot box, but you give them a 4-foot box that gives them extra drop energy, so to speak, to harness for the rebound to get back up onto the next box. So that's a badass nervous system, right? It's like it's literally like figured that out. Whereas most of us, I jump off of something 3 feet, and I'm just hoping, okay, did I break anything good? I'm just gonna walk away, and cross my fingers, and thank my lucky stars. So what happens then? And this is something. So this will be the first thing we can kind of apply to progressive overload as you're moving along your path of trying to get stronger and using your logbook as a guide to drive the stimulus for muscle growth, is that when you're lifting and you're doing movements that become somewhat ballistic or with somewhat of a bounce at the bottom, like people will do on a bench press, or variety of movements, you're harnessing a stretch shortening cycle to some degree.
Okay.
And on the bench press, especially, I've seen people who do bench presses and literally you can see the bar like creating this massive indentation in their chest. It's you can see the recoil in their rib cage. The musculature is like all bent down. It looks like, dude, are you made of rubber? It's like, you ever do the experiment in like science class where you take like a turkey bone, you put it in vinegar?
No.
It leaches out all the minerals? Okay. You can do that. You take a turkey bone and put it like the wishbone. You drop it in vinegar, it leach out all the calcium phosphate and the bone mineralization. Then you have just the connective tissue, like this really rubbery thing.
Weird.
It's kind of cool. Yeah. It's very weird. It's like, whoa, that's kind of a funky looking bone. So people can do that if they want. It's a great thing for kids. Like it's a nice little sciencey experiment. But you see people who do bench presses sometimes, not that often anymore, but who's literally their rib cages look like that. It's like, dude, you look like your rib cage is nothing but cartilage because you're just sinking in. That strength that they get from that bounce is part of what we're seeing here in a nervous system that's learned how to make use of a stretch shortening cycle in the musculature, as well as with the bar bounce off the chest and all these other skill related things that actually increase performance so they can get a heavier weight back up to the starting point. But that's because the nervous system has figured out how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much because they have a larger muscle mass in order to drive that. And I have a little bit of a caveat to that, to some degree, because you're stronger on an eccentric than you are on a concentric. But so there's sort of a gray zone here where being somewhat ballistic on some movements makes sense to accommodate those differences in strength. That's the topic for the next podcast on sloppy form. But when you're bouncing things, and you can tell you're bouncing things, that's making use of a stretch shortening cycle to some degree, which is the nervous system. And remember, the nervous system's smart as shit. It'll figure out how to allow you to get stronger and better in the gym, unless you disallow all that and keep your form as consistent as you possibly can. So rep tempo is an obvious one with something like someone who's gotten sloppy on a bench, or doing a pause where you eliminate the stretch shortening. So you put if you're doing your rep counts, make that a 0 count or even a 1 count with a pause.
Mm-hmm.
Like people sometimes do. They'll do a reset on a deadlift rather than bouncing off the floor.
I do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I do that with my bench press too, especially now that I have my bar the shoulder saver pad. I can bring the bar right down to my chest, kind of reset it, and then drive, right back down. Same thing.
Right.
So is this a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not putting the pieces together in my head here.
So if someone starts off and they've got very little stretch shortening cycle involved, and over the course of 6 months, let's say, they continue to bench press or whatever movements they're using, where a stretch or a bounce or that sort of stretch shortening cycle, but it could be like a full dead or even like deadlifting a rack dead where you bounce the bar off of the supports.
Yeah.
Anything you get this sort of rapid bounce from the bottom, from the changeover from the eccentric to the concentric, that's very rapid. That is got some component that's a stretch shortening cycle, which is a very savvy way for your nervous system to get that weight moving from an eccentric lowering direction vector back in the other way. And that's just the nervous system doing that. So you could go from not being very good at that and not employing that at day 0 of your training blast or your off season to 6 months later, you've gotten pretty adept at stretch shortening and having, as we see in that last figure you put up, facilitation rather than inhibition.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're seeing in the logbook isn't representative of muscle growth. It's representative of a neurological adaptation.
I see. Yeah.
So that's the whole trick, is you don't want the logbook to represent that. You want the logbook to represent muscle growth.
Yeah.
To the extent you possibly can. It's almost impossible to do that completely.
Yeah.
just because it's going to happen. Even with, you take a new exercise, you keep the rep tempo the same, you're still going to have nervous system adaptations, that are going to occur to allow the strength gain to happen. You have it especially if you're a newbie or it's an exercise you've never done before, or you're coming back to, even if you use a metronome, you're still going to have you're going to still have some neurological and even some other morphological things that will happen, that are allowing for those strength improvements or those performance improvements that aren't muscle growth.
Okay. So
you want to keep everything else the same. Yes.
So here's what I'm getting then, that when I brought this question to you in the last episode, I was looking at how this adaptation of central nervous system allows us to dig further, get further into our sets and our reps, and be able to handle kind of like more intensity and grind out, more reps than we might have been able to handle previous years ago, months ago, whatever. Right. I was seeing this as the positive aspects of this. What you're telling us is that the central nervous system, because it can get stronger than the amount of muscle you're gaining, that it could be a bad thing, really. That it could, a strong central nervous system could be overriding the muscle. That, like, you may be getting stronger, but it could be your central nervous system getting stronger, not that your muscle's getting bigger.
Well, yeah, something's happening in the central nervous system. Not that it's quote unquote getting stronger, but it's getting more adept at moving those loads.
Yeah.
You're getting stronger, your performance is better, but not because the muscle has gotten bigger, but because the central nervous system has developed a better strategy for lifting the weight.
Yeah.
And some of that could be like, like digging in and learning how to grind and learning how to psych up and push yourself.
Uh-huh.
For many, many years, and I still have this tendency to do this, I will get so riled up and overstimulated. I'm like, there's an inverted U between performance and arousal level. No arousal, and you shit the porch, like it's not good, like you just like a horrible set, like you got to be ready.
Yeah.
And then you more and more arousal, eventually, you're at like a peak arousal level that matches what is needed for the skill aspect as well as sort of the central drive aspect. So if it's a squat, and let's say like Ben Chow is someone who talks about this, probably a lot of people have heard of and know. And Ben's a great guy, and he's got a really, really proficient squat. And for him, he very much needs to be very in a calm, centered place. I'm not trying to speak for Ben, but this is what I picked up on from at least 3 or 4 times he's mentioned this on Fuad's podcast when he's been on. He goes in, and he's not like, getting slapped around and like, smelling salts and all this kind of stuff. For him, he has to find this very, very specific, nuanced, skilled groove for his squats, so that he can have his best squat performance. And the amount of like overall psychological arousal, like, rip roaring, ready to go, like, break down walls, that's an easy thing for him. That component has to be balanced for him in a certain way. So for him, if his arousal gets beyond that, like if he tried to like, put on Metallica and scream and yell and bang his head against the bar and get under there and squat, he'd probably fuck himself up.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be optimal for him at all. So your nervous system is going to have, and this is what I tend to do sometimes, I get because it's fun to get like all fucking crazy and stupid and be a meathead. And what happens then is I will get under the bar, and I'm so aggressive with it.
Yes.
That I will do really rapid. My reps will be rapid.
Yep.
And part of that rapidity is essentially somewhat of a stretch shortening cycle. You'll see, like, if it's overhead press and I come down, I'm doing this thing. So instead of trying to like really focus on my delts, have a good mind muscle connection there, I'm doing a lot of shrugging. So you're coming down here, and I'm shrugging the weight at that bottom part to get more reps, and I'm just throwing the weight around essentially,
right,
in a very uncontrolled fashion. So I'll get more reps, but my arousal level was so high that I didn't keep the form the way it was the previous 10 times I'd done that exercise.
Yeah.
So that's almost meaningless for tracking progression in the gym. Now, if you come in every single time and do it that way every single time, then that's probably okay, to be honest. Except that, of course, that's a more injury prone. It's a more dangerous way to train.
Yeah.
When you're just sort of letting it rip completely.
Yeah, Chris Duffin talked about the same thing when I was asking him about his 1,001 pound for 3-rep squat. He was saying that in his training he had to remain calm. That he said, like, he was talking about like lifting 900 pounds calm, doing that week after week. That working in those, like, up in that rep range without getting amped up, without getting psyched up, in order to train and have the strength he needed to get where he wanted to be.
Yeah, I think, and I've listened to a little bit of his stuff, and you tell me this may be right, maybe wrong, but he also his movement had to be very, very precise. It was actually a really highly skilled thing for him to do. He spent enough years of his life under heavy loads that being able to address that. Sometimes, like, here's the obvious thing that happens to people: you get under a big squat, and if you're not psychologically ready, like in that sort of aggressive state, and the bar gets on your back, and you're like, oh fuck, this is heavy.
Yeah, you don't want that.
That's not what you want on your mindset. So for Chris, or someone who's done a lot of that, he already knows how to get past that and put himself in the right level of aggressive state to handle those super heavy, like superhuman loads. But what he also needs in order to get those 3 reps or to train in that way is a highly skilled movement.
Yeah.
So he has to have his wits about him.
Yep.
And be calm in a certain way. He can't be like just, rip roaring, just as an absolute maniac lunatic, because then he won't have the skill component in place that he needs to have.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to feel that way. He doesn't need to offset the feeling of the heavy load, because he's been there.
Yeah.
That's his home, man. He's been into those loads, many, 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 many times. So it doesn't freak him out.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to overcompensate with excessive aggressive arousal. Like some people, you have to learn how to do that over the years, So
I would love to get him back on and have him on with you.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be a cool conversation to get you guys together and talk about this.
So, this is funny. I'm going to tie some things together we've talked about with what you just said with Chris, is that, over the years, depending on the person's mentality and how that lifting fits with their life and probably a number of other things, but eventually you sort of learn how to get focused and get aggressive and be, take on a high arousal frame of mind in order to handle progressively heavier, more difficult and stressful loads. And at some point in time, like it's almost as if like that box has been checked, and you can do that. Like nothing's you could always turn that on whenever you need to.
Yeah.
But in order to figure that out, you have to learn that. It's sort of like a sprinter. And some people some people don't run very well, and some people run better than others, but rarely do we actually sprint. So part of sprinting is it has to be a max effort to sprint. But a very big part of sprinting, and sprinters know this, anyone who's ever been on a speed related track athlete, they do tons of form running. High knees and all this kind of stuff. Like the gait that you have is really, really important. So, and they talk about having like a loose jaw or loose hands.
Oh, wow.
You ever heard this before?
No.
Yeah. So some people this may be resonating with. So, yeah. So the idea is that you're driving, like you're sprinting. It's all out. Like it's, if you're a world-class person, it's, less than 11 seconds.
Yeah. Or,
maybe a couple more if you're a woman, maybe, but it's not a prolonged effort. But you have to be relaxed at the same time you're putting out a maximal effort. So for someone who's wants to run a 100-meter dash and they don't really run, it's probably best for them just to run as hard as they can. It's going to be all over the place.
Yeah.
You don't look like an absolute idiot trying to do that.
You were running from something.
Running from a bear.
Right.
Exactly. So, but the highly advanced person knows how to turn on that maximal arousal level. And now because of what they're so that box has been checked, but now there's the skill component, which needs to be really, really focused as well. Because it's sort of like, when you're lifting that high of a level with big loads like that, and I can't even fathom what that was like for Chris. I mean, like that's beyond my level for sure. But I sort of liken it to something it's as if you're not. It's like dragsters. Getting back to like a racing analogy. So those big long dragsters that they set speed records with. Like if those get off angle just like a little bit, they just go flying off the fucking the track.
Yeah.
Because you're going so fast. you shoot a rocket, it's off by like 1%. I think this happens with rockets too. So like they fire so fast, and if they're off trajectory by a little bit, they never maintain an orbital path around the Earth, and they just fly off into space. So a little bit of being off a little bit makes it or breaks it for those high speed, high performance rocket like things. So if Chris has got 900 pounds on his back and he's off by a little bit in some aspect of his form, or Ben, like the effects that's going to have because of the load that is being lifted there in terms of joint forces and muscle coordination could be enough to cause a tragic injury.
Yeah.
If he's off by a smidge. Whereas if you're squatting 135, or you see like some people like you'll see people like they just got like stupid strength, like quote unquote retard strength. They're just like they get into I think that's why they call it this. Some people are so naturally strong, and you look at them, you're like, that form is terrible. You could tell they've never done that. Like I use the term motor moron sometimes. Like that person, like they're just like all over the place, but they're so strong. So you can get away with that with lighter loads. But once you get to those higher loads that you can only lift because so much skill is there, then your nervous system has to be really, really in play and really tuned in. So yeah, there's a higher level beyond developing the ability to grind that really is a matter of, I think, in large part when you're trying to do those low rep lifts like triples or doubles or singles like powerlifters, which I don't try to do.
Yeah, me either.
So that's one aspect. So let's go back one more thing that this is kind of a big piece.
Okay.
If we go back to that plot with the comparing the squat and the leg press and the knee extension.
All right, give me just a second here. That was the one we already looked at?
Yep.
Okay.
And I'm going to flip the script back around on you, Scott, and see if I can cause your brain to untwist itself and twist back the other direction.
All right, we've got that one back up.
Okay, so here's the interesting thing. So this person, like, if you take an individual in that study, they've increased quad size. The legs are bigger. I assume the hamstrings are. Everything's gotten bigger because they've squatted. And so law of diminishing returns is going to tell us that their squat gains are going to be less and less over time. They got that 70% increase in squat run rate max over 2 or 3 months of training, what have you. But it's not going to keep increasing. They're not going to get 140% in the next 3 months and another 70%.
I wish.
It's going to peter off.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, right. It would be awesome. And that's what we see in the logbook. You pick up a new exercise, even if it's not really new for you, but it's one you haven't done in a bit, and you get good for 3 or 4 or 5 workouts. You get good strength gains, and eventually those will start to peter off. And so you've got something interesting going on there, and this is the other aspect of those neurological component that is sort of going on underneath that we really can't do much about it, just the nature of how things work. But let's say you're someone who does a really good job, your form is dead on, you got a good mind-muscle connection, your tempo is the same, you're not doing any bouncing or stretch shortening, so comparing workout by workout, everything is the same, but you're increasing the load. Well, something is going on there underneath in terms of activation such that you're able to get a better stimulus because your nervous system is learning how to lift those heavier loads. At least we hope, to some degree. This is where it gets a little bit tricky because it made actually your nervous system, if you look back at one of those first plots we have, is that the amount of activation per amount of muscle actually may be going down. But we presume that if you compare like workout 1 versus workout 10, where everything's the same in terms of your form, number of sets, blah, 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 and you've increased your strength by 20%, that now you're getting a stronger stimulus because you're lifting heavier loads or using more weight. But you keep going beyond that, and you don't get stronger anymore. So you're not able to evoke in your training a greater stimulus from lifting a heavier load or doing more reps. You're just sort of plateauing out.
Yeah.
And what you see now then, and you saw this at the beginning too, but what you see now then is that if you're an advanced person, you put on 5 pounds of muscle in the course of a year, that's pretty good, right? And that's distributed over the whole body. So let's say 2.5 of that is in your lower body, with the primary muscles that are involved with the squat, which is taking that example. And that 2.5 pounds, like now you're getting that over 12 months. So, what are we getting, like a quarter of a pound every month? That's
Yeah.
not going to show up as tremendous strength gains. So you're not going to see in the gym. I mean, you can still microload a little bit, and that's definitely helpful to do. But you're not. So now what is happening strength-wise is representative of what's happening muscle-wise in those lifts that you've been doing for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But now let's think about the knee extension and think about it just as another lift. You've now got more muscle, but you've got no strength gains on the knee extension.
Okay.
Or let's say it's the barbell squat, and if we went and compared that during a hammer strength squat or a leg press or something else that trains the same musculature, you're not going to have those same strength gains. But if we go then after you plateaued out on the squat and you can't evoke a greater stimulus because you've just been doing that exercise for so long, you change exercises.
Yeah.
And guess what? You still can train pretty hard, but what happens to the strength gains you get in that new exercise over time? It starts to go up.
Sure.
You'll once again start progressing. And in progressing, you're going to increase the stimulus on those muscles that are being trained. So the novel exercise that you swapped out for the one that plateaued,
Mm-hmm.
that novel exercise now becomes a novel stimulus. And a novel stimulus is what you want for new muscle growth. The whole reason why the muscle grows is because the stimulus demands it to, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
To use a kind of a Fletcherism here, is that you're forcing the muscle to grow with a novel stimulus. And you're only going to get that in some way, shape, or form by asking the muscle to do something it hasn't previously done.
Yeah.
And the novelty of that new exercise creates some new activation patterns, or something new and different is going on, such that you're getting more loading or more reps or higher weight in progressing strength-wise or performance-wise when you're using that new exercise.
Yeah.
So that's why we swap exercises.
That makes sense.
And you'll see that right off the bat. Let's say you're doing barbell squats, and then you go do the hammer strength squat, same number of sets, relative loads the same, reps are about the same, and you just get sore as shit.
Yeah.
Right? It's a new activation pattern. Something different about it. That tells you that you stress the muscle in a way you hadn't previously, which is exactly what you want. Novelty of stimulus, so that there's something that requires an adaptation.
Yeah.
So that's what's pretty cool about that is, like, if you think about the knee extension, they've got over those, let's say it was 3 months study. 3 months of study, they got a 60 or 70% increase in the squat, nothing in the knee extension, but they've got 10% more muscle mass. Now imagine they just started doing knee extensions, how fast their strength gains go up.
Yeah.
And that's even a more quad-focused exercise. So that they could harness strength gains off of that and ride that for a long time. Maybe they just did knee extensions and leg presses, drop the squat for a while. Their squat would go down. They might lose it a little bit, maybe not. But then they could then reharness using the squat, hopefully because they've spent 3 or 4 months gaining more muscle mass through those other exercises, which now can be applied to the squat. So you just simply harness those periods of time of novelty and underlying increases in stimulation that come as a part of the nervous system doing what it does to allow for those performance increases, learning how to stimulate the muscle to do what you're telling it to do, which is lift heavier loads for the same number of reps or getting more reps with the same loads or both. And so the nervous system then becomes your friend because it's learning how to evoke a greater stimulus because you're requiring it to.
Okay.
You're asking that. That's your voluntary. That's like, we're going to do this. I'm going to get 12 reps no matter what, come hell, high or water. And you do, because that's a reasonable goal to have. And the nervous system figures out how to make it happen. So the nervous system adaptations can be a good thing because that's what allows us, to some degree, to progress incrementally in a progressive fashion when we're rotating exercises in and out over time.
Yeah. It gets me thinking, too, about how important it is to have some variety in my workouts. You know, to not just rely on the one thing that I love, you know. Maybe squats are king. You know, a lot of people would argue that, like, hey, if you did one exercise, squat, which, I mean, there's probably some good, it's probably not bad advice, but, you know, also leg press, also extensions, all these things, I mean, are going to have, you know, quite a role in the development.
In the fortitude training loading sets, people pick 3 primary exercises. Let's literally for thighs, which is glutes, quads, hams, adductors, kind of lump them all together. So that might be like a barbell back squat and then a machine squat and like a leg press, let's say.
Okay.
And let's say back's their favorite. But they're also, and I did this in part for some other reasons, but one of the reasons I set up the loading sets, though they do a compound exercise and then an isolation exercise. So you might do a squat, a knee extension, a squat, a hamstring curl, and then a squat again if you're using the highest volume tier. So you love squats. You want to squat. Like you feel like you're not even, if squat's not part of your problem, you're not a man.
Yeah, yeah.
If it's not the program, like you're not a bodybuilder. It doesn't work. You have to have squats. So you're moving along over time, trying to make progress on the squats, and you're plateauing on barbell squats. So one of the things you can do, and it employs the same thing because remember, there's something going on with the activation pattern, which is allowing us to get those increases in strength over time, even without giant increases in muscle mass. And that's part of what is probably novel and part of the learning process, such that when you do something you haven't done for a while, you get really sore because the activation pattern doesn't know quite what to make of it.
Right.
Or it's just a different activation pattern that you haven't had before. So it's a novel stimulus because of that. So you're moving along like you've been squatting for, say 4 months, and your squats, nothing's going up. So what I would then tell people to do is keep the squats in there. Well, one option is I want you to now put the knee extensions first. So your first set is knee extensions, and then you're pre-fatigued, and then you go and you squat. Well, that creates a weak link in the quads, and it alters feels totally different. I've got someone, I won't say it is, I want to name, but someone who I helped with a couple things who's now doing some pre-fatiguing stuff for chest.
Okay.
And it's a really strong, is a pro, really strong guy, and he had never done that before. And the first time he did it, when he went to his presses, he was like flabbergasted as to how much he felt it right in his chest.
I'd say Dave Henry, but I don't think it's Dave Henry. I've seen him do pre-fatiguing a long time ago.
No, this isn't Dave. Someone else.
Okay.
But anyway, just an example of someone that just worked for, and he could tell. Like the first, was like he sent me. He's like, holy shit.
Yeah.
He felt it so much in his chest more than he had, and that was just with pre-fatiguing exercises. So you do that now.
I think I know. I'm going to guess after the show.
You probably, yeah, I'm sure you do. So you do that now with the quads, and then you hit the squats. So those squats feel totally different.
Yeah, yeah.
And your load has to go down, or your reps go down, one of the two, because of the pre-fatiguing. Just the simple fact that you fatigued one of the muscles that wasn't otherwise.
Yeah.
Especially if you're squatting in a way that, like a high bar squat or what have you, you're trying to literally get the quads, whatever you happen to be doing to using the squats for. And so now you have a new starting point because you've mixed things up. So now you do knee extension, squat, hamstring curl, squat, and then maybe a last set of squats, or maybe you put the hamstring curl between the second and the third set of squats. You can do it all sorts of ways. You've switched the order. And so now you have a new baseline, and you start to progress from there. Because it basically becomes kind of a new exercise, given the pre-fatigue there. It feels totally different for some people.
Sure.
Having pre-fatigue, like this person I just mentioned. So then you progress, you get to keep squats in your rotation.
Yeah.
And when you plateau with that order of exercises, you switch it up a different way. You put the hamstring curls first. And then you have pre-fatigue hamstring curls. Or maybe you put hamstring curls and the knee extensions, like one right after another. If you want to, you could do that. I don't mind people like straying from the standard template I have. Yeah. And then you do your 3 sets. You could do it that way. So, but you get to keep squats in there because you like those and you're driven to do them, and it's motivating. And then of course there's bands and chains and all those sorts of things you can do to keep them in. But all those order of exercises, bands and chains are ways to add in variety, which match the loading curve to the strength curve, or simply change the nature of the exercise so that it's novel enough that you get sore.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I don't get this so often anymore, but people used to like call me out on Instagram and say, why you do all these weird exercises? And I kind of explained this to him. I was like, why don't you stick to the basics? Like I still do the basics, but I just heard from another client actually today who I have doing, those row stop deads.
Yes.
Do you remember that? The row stop deads? Yeah. I suggested he do those and actually do some really slow rack deadlifts.
Okay.
And And because I just been seeing something in his pictures, his check-in pictures, that I wanted to sort of focus on his back a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he did both. He ended up incorporating both of them into the same workout, as it turned out.
Yeah.
Which doesn't surprise me about him, which is awesome. It's not criticism. He's just going for it. That's how he is. And he said he couldn't hardly sleep. He was so sore.
Oh my gosh.
This guy's been training for decades.
Yeah.
He's been doing deadlifts. He's been doing bent over rows. He's like, what the hell? Like, why the hell did this happen? And it's because it was so novel and so different, and those exercises, the way I had him do them, simply required him to use his lats in a way that, despite the fact that he's been doing deadlifts and rack deads, he's been doing bent over rows, all the components are the same. It's not like I had him hanging, by his bootstraps, off the roof of his house, using a dumbbell while he was whistling Dixie through a kazoo. It was nothing crazy.
Right.
It was just a change in form, a little bit of change in tempo, and the nature of those exercises demand that his back be involved in a way that he had never done that. He had never done either of those, and he put them both in the same workout and had a hard time sleeping from the soreness. I think if I'm getting it, literally the soreness came on so fast it was the day of the workout.
Oh, that's going to be a rough one.
Those are exactly when you get sore that. And I remember the first time I did the rack deadlifts this way. People might be asking. This is something that Dante first mentioned this, like doing really slow rack deads. And I said, okay, well, here's what I'm going to do, because I knew I had that tendency to speed up tempo.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, I'm going to use a metronome.
Oh, yeah.
He said, well, you go ahead if you want to. So I always suggest they actually literally get a metronome.
Yeah.
So you start from your normal pulling height, below the knee or mid-shin, whatever it might be,
yeah,
with a weight that would probably be like half or less of what you might do for, a set of 8 to 10. It's got to be really light. And basically 1 second up, sort of explode up. Eventually there's going to be no explosion because you'll be so fatigued, but pull up fast. And then once you get to the top, go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, up. 0, 1, 2, and try to make the descent even, so you're not like really slow at the top and then dropping at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be, the same rate of descent through the entire 4 seconds.
That's a brutal.
Especially at the bottom.
That's a brutal negative.
And you have to just keep going. If you can't stay on tempo, then the set's over with.
Hey, I got a tip too. Hot tip. You don't even need to buy a metronome now. You can just. I was gonna look for an app. Oh. But yeah, I just typed it into Google, and literally it's like the thing. It's just a widget or whatever. It's a thing on.
Yeah. Of course.
It's just right on there. Yeah, you don't even need to download anything.
Put it on your headphone. You don't have to bother anyone in the gym with your, Alfred Hitchcock,
right.
TikTok.
Although that would be a lot sweeter to get that thing out, wind it up, and.
I had a little electronic one. In fact, it's probably in my gym bag still. A little bag of good, tricks.
Yeah.
My little like spy bag of bullshit that I carry around with me.
And shit's gonna get real serious if Scott pulls the metronome out. You're gonna be hurting.
Yeah. I remember because Dave and I, speaking of, we would do those, and he'd be like, oh, he'd see the metronome, and he'd be like cowering.
It'll be like worse than a cattle prod.
It's like the cattle prod. Some dogs you get out the nail clippers and what you're gonna do, and they took a dick off, or trying to get him in the bath. No, not the metronome.
Yeah.
So, but it's just tempo, and that's a force mind muscle connection. So anyway, the point there is that those new exercises, the simple fact that in that particular study they had muscle growth, but they had no strength gains on those exercises they didn't do, suggests that there's room for neurological adaptations and an increased load that can come about in doing those new exercises you haven't been doing.
Yeah.
And just learning how to do those, as long as you keep your form don't train like an asshole, so to speak, and start bouncing with the weight and what have you. Keep your form under control, use a good mind muscle connection, et cetera, et cetera. But those exercises you have been doing are ones that are ripe for exploiting the fact that your nervous system will allow you to lift heavier loads and thus produce a greater stimulus for growth over time.
Mm-hmm.
You just want to make sure you're not allowing some of those other neurological mechanisms, like the stretch shortening disinhibition we saw with the box jumps and the plyometrics, to come into play. Yeah. So you want to let the nervous system do its thing, and some of that is psychological drive, learning how to grind, so that you can get greater stimulus, but don't start cheating like rolling your shoulders back on curls, throwing in body English intentionally, just to get more reps. Unless, of course, you're doing that because you're being a very mindful manipulator of the fact that the force velocity curve of skeletal muscle tells us that there's a reason why a little bit of body English would make sense in terms of loading.
Yeah.
That's the topic for next week, maybe, if we get into it.
I look forward to that.
Yeah, it's cool stuff. So I think that's the thing. So this is, we talked about the cross training effect, which is pretty interesting. The fact that we see the activation level for a given amount of force going down, so the nervous system's figuring out, in training, what's going on there. The muscle also got bigger. That stretch shortening cycle and rep tempo, like pretty much to some degree, if your rep tempo is speeding up, just empirically, just from what I've seen, like as a coach and myself and people I've worked with, that faster rep tempo means you're probably doing somewhat of a stretch shortening cycle.
It
just does. I mean, you're just doing when you start to go too fast, that's the only way that's coming about.
Yeah. You can feel it. You can feel it. Because I do that. I've mentioned it a bunch of times now, but the way David Smith had helped me with my incline dumbbell press is to really control that negative down. And, I pretty much try to give that a pause. I try to be in control of everything I'm doing, but I will find myself getting ahead of myself a little bit. It's a heavier weight. I'm getting excited and I see myself starting to move faster. But when you slow it back down, you feel it, because then your ability to get reps changes. You know what I mean? Like you're cranking it, and then you're like, oh shit, I'm getting a little too hyped. Settle it down, Scott. And then it's like, oh God, now I can't even get another rep. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You get stuck faster.
Yeah. There's one of the things I have an explanation for this. I don't know if it's it's just my interpretation of what's going on, but one of the things you find too when you do that is that you'll be banging out the reps, and then your set will come kind of to a screeching halt.
Yeah.
Like when you die, you don't have as many grinder reps.
Yeah. Okay, I could see that.
When you do it that way, yeah.
Huh.
So that's kind of a sign of that.
Interesting.
And some of that, there's a couple reasons potentially. One is, you're also in harnessing that stretch shortening cycle. You may be, depending on the exercise, but you may be allowing yourself to sort of rebound through a sticking point in the exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So you're rebounding and you're driving through the sticking point, and eventually, as you start to fatigue and you can't get as much of the stretch shortening cycle as you were before, that sticking point becomes much more evident.
Because you don't have as much
sudden,
bounce.
You just hit it and boom, you kind of hit a wall. Yeah. You can't bounce through it in that way.
Yeah.
There's also something someone asked me a question, which was a really good question actually, on Instagram that I talked about. He asked, or I answered for him, which fits in here. He asked, can you still maximally activate when you're fatigued? So let's say you reduce your strength level by 25%. Can you still activate those he didn't say it this way, but basically was wondering, can you still activate those high threshold motor units in a fatigue state? And I think you can. The question is whether you can fully activate a muscle anyway, period, in the first and foremost.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to quantify. That's a whole other side tangent, because the main way that's been evaluated in the past is with a methodology that's obviously flawed. It doesn't make sense. Some of the things that they demonstrate, given the rest of the literature around strength. So it's hard to know. But one of the things that happens with that stretch shortening cycle, which we see there in that EMG, is that when you get good at that, you have a facilitation of the activation as opposed to inhibition. So you're activating more muscle, so you can tighten up the muscle and harness that elastic energy for the recoil when you bounce back past your sticking point. And some of that may involve using some really high threshold motor units that are difficult to get, and those are the ones that would be the least likely to be easily turned on in a fatigue state. So fresh versus fatigued, especially when the pain's starting to come in, pain will inhibit motor neuron output. Trying to be bouncy with the weight and drive in that sort of highly aroused state at the end of a set is less likely to be a possibility for you. So you're likely to kind of lose that neurological capacity at the end of a set. So all of the things being equal, you've got a fatigued muscle and everything else, but you just can't do that bouncy stuff anymore because your nervous system is fatigued. You're in pain, maybe, and other things are going on. So, like, all the stuff that happens with that facilitation is no longer within the realm of possibility because you may not be able to fully activate, or at least activate in the same way. Plus, you've also got a slower muscle, too, when it's fatigued. And speed is important, especially if you're moving quickly, because you want to be able to lower it down, but then tighten up at the appropriate time in a coordinated fashion to allow that energy to be translated into the elastic components to then be harnessed.
Yeah.
So a slower muscle is not going to do very good at that. So be very good at that. People with faster muscle fiber types do better with jumping and ballistic types of movements. And this is a ballistic type of movement. So you're going to lose muscle speed in a fatigue state just because you're fatigued, because muscle is simply slower when it's fatigued. That's just the nature of the beast because of the ability to supply energy.
That makes sense.
So, yeah, well, kind of. Like, there's a lot there. You play it about 10 times, it might make more sense. But
my brain is full at this point. If this was my brain,
anyway,
it's up to here at this point. It's good. It's
no
good.
More. Stop. It's killing. So. Anyway, I thought that would be helpful. That's like, it may be a little bit, that's just kind of brain candy, I think, to some degree. It may be like I really didn't even know that, but the bottom line is that the variety of training makes sense, and keeping your form the same makes sense.
Yeah.
So that you can let the nervous system do what it's good at to help you get a better stimulus along the route to using progressive overload as a way of evoking more muscle growth.
Absolutely.
So,
well, Scott, let's get out of here. We did have a few questions that popped up, but we don't have the time today. So I'll try to save these stuff that was off topic from this. I'll try to save these. We could do like a Q&A toward the end of the next episode, or whatever. We could figure something out. But with that said, of course, check out Scott's book, Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. You guys can't see it in our framing, but I've got it up on the shelf over there. You can pick that up at byobbcoach.com or check out Amazon, or it's at Amazon, right? As well as Barnes & Noble.
Amazon and Barnes & Noble both, yeah.
You can get the hard copy there. And, of course, go to fortitudetraining.net. You can get the Fortitude Training ebook. And my headphones died. They're dying right now. So we're cutting off right at the perfect time.
Way out,
of course, guys, check out our great sponsor, TrueNutrition.com. I just got my next order of my Team Skip Blend protein, as well as the old school unflavored EAAs. Big old bag, like 50 servings for like $25. You really can't beat that pricing for some good intra-workout EAAs. Scott, as always, I appreciate you, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks for doing all this, my man. Yes.
See you guys.
Until next time.